everything blew up. A massive Viet Cong attack at a place called Pleiku. Over 100 American airmen were killed or wounded in this Viet Cong attack right after the election. There'll be 2 more other attacks too. Pleiku is right here in the Central Highlands. And so now this high-profile attack. Here's Johnson winning the sweeping election in this. At the same time, the Civil Rights, or the Civil Rights Act did not cover voting rights. Johnson tried to convince leaders of the civil rights movement, wait a year, because we just passed the Civil Rights Act. No, they wanted the right to vote now. And remember what I told you about politics. You push. So right after Pleiku, so remember, this is all these things are happening at once. Oh, no, right here. Civil rights, the movement had a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And in this march, the idea was Alabama was the most segregationist state. Their governor, George Wallace, was the most rabidly anti-civil rights governor in America. They would be stopped by the police and then attacked by thugs. One person would be murdered on this march. And now Johnson has no choice but to act. They made Johnson act. And so, after this, Johnson realizes, I must push for a civil rights bill. And also said there'd be another march, Selma 2. U.S. federal marshals would protect the march. So that march is actually 2. It was a lot more boring. I love to read the paper. I just think that's a great one to see marches. Yeah.
So what happened at Pleiku?
Pleiku, a massive attack by the Viet Cong against a U.S. air base supporting the South Vietnamese. Remember, the U.S. is just still advising. But now Johnson, if I want a Voting Rights Act, I can't have Vietnam, South Vietnam blow up anymore. So all this is going together. And this would have been the time for Johnson to say, we've won in Vietnam, and get out. But he couldn't do it. And so Operation Rolling Thunder would be initiated right after Selma. It's just such an amazing thing. This is going to be bombing in North Vietnam to try to convince the North to quit helping the Viet Cong. This bombing, it'd be relatively controlled. They didn't want World War III. Don't bomb China. They thought they could bomb just a few targets in North Vietnam would quit helping the South. They go to the peace tables, 2 Vietnams. This would go on until 1968. By 1968, the United States would drop more bombs in Rolling Thunder than all the bombs that were dropped in the European theater of World War II. And we dropped significantly more in the South. But here's the issue. If we're going to have air bases, we can't have another Pleiku. So in March, right after Rolling Thunder, we sent the first regular Marines into Da Nang. Da Nang is a harbor city right there in northern South Vietnam. I know that sounds weird. The Marines literally hit the beaches. That's them, like an invasion. They landed on landing craft, and they were met by young South Vietnamese girls giving them candy and flowers. It's kind of surreal. But here's what happened. So now the troops are there. Now, okay, you can't say we're not tough, but the problem is the Viet Cong started lobbing orders at the Marines. What do the Marines want to do? Go get them. If they go get them, that's escalation. That's full-scale war. Voting rights, Pleiku, Rolling Thunder, all these things come together now to a monumental decision. Right after Da Nang, Johnson went to Congress and asked for a Civil Rights Act, or Voting Rights Act. Even though he knew, in fact, walked off saying, there goes the Democratic Party in the South. And he'd be right in a lot of ways. They'd all become Republicans. Not all, but a significant number. Take about 20 years. But demanded a Voting Rights Act. Demanded it. But now, to get it passed, and other key bills passed. What about Vietnam? Do you escalate? Do you pull out? If there's another Pleiku, no Voting Rights Act? Johnson went to his advisors, and every advisor but one said escalate. And Johnson, who didn't really understand the whole situation, his love was the Great Society. He believed him. Most importantly, Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense. He said, if we escalate, the North will go to the peace table and we'll win the war. In fact, they had the carrot and stick. They promised North Vietnam, they promised Ho Chi Minh a bunch of money if he would just end helping the Viet Cong. And we also bombed. Johnson, we know, didn't want to do this. He didn't want this. He said it many times, at least, let me rephrase that. He said he didn't want it. But he was so scared to lose a war. What if he lost it? Then the Great Society goes. And so, de-escalation. Full-scale war. June of '65, the Tonkin resolution would be the give it legitimacy. And Johnson committed forces. And he made it very gradual first, almost casual. We'll send a couple divisions, a couple brigades of Marines, a few air bases. And his reasons to do it would be save the Great Society. He passed all these laws, but they need money. They need to be improved. Mistakes were made. There's always mistakes on complex laws. Complex laws are really difficult because there's all these unforeseen circumstances that you really cannot predict. Also, JFK made South Vietnam important. He didn't want to go have people say JFK or JFK's legacy was destroyed by Johnson, especially Kennedy's brothers Robert or RFK and LBJ hated each other's guts. And Robert Kennedy was going around the country saying, Johnson's going to lose Vietnam, South Vietnam. What my brother said was my brother's legacy. My brother said we must sacrifice for this. Ironically, then Robert Kennedy would come out against the war. And then credibility. Back to that Berlin thing, back to here. But here's the issue. Johnson also knew if he all of a sudden committed the United States to a full-scale war, his popularity would go down. If he called out the reserves or the National Guard and sent people away from their families, he'd go unpopular. So, even though Johnson knew it might require 500 to 750,000 troops, he kept it secret. Thinking, I can't let people know the sacrifice that's coming. So the United States public was not prepared when there would be hundreds of Americans killed and wounded every week by '67. And the other thing is this. Johnson knew it would require hundreds of thousands of troops, but it's going to take a long time. Look at the escalation numbers. The first troops, he was told not to get about 500,000 troops when we have a chance. And even then, it probably wouldn't be enough. So he lied. He didn't tell the American public of the sacrifice that's coming. Didn't tell them. Even though he knew that's a lie. He thought he could have both. Victory in South Vietnam and the Great Society. The Great Society is going to be severely undermined. Never be as effective as Johnson wants. The programs will always be halfway efforts. Medicare would turn out to be maybe the most successful government program. But like Medicare is going to have problems or Medicaid's going to have problems to this day. He never called up and the majority of the soldiers then, as the war would go on, would be drafted. And that would become the base of the anti-war movement. But in the short run, it worked. That summer, Medicare, health care for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor, and the Voting Rights Act were all passed. Remember Harry Truman wanted a health insurance for everybody? So President Truman was at the signing of Medicare. He passed away in '72. And here he is at the Voting Rights Act. There's Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act with the King. So they got this passed. Johnson thought everything's fine, and then all hell broke loose. Because Vietnam did not go well. People expected a quick victory, even though they knew it was going to be hard. But one thing we have to get before that. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the 50s and the 60s. He was appointed by Eisenhower, the Republican governor of California. Earl Warren's right here. And Warren's court would turn out to be the most liberal, pro-civil rights court in American history. Probably the second most important court after the Marshall Court, which did Margaret versus Madison and all that. And conservatives hated Warren, hated his court. That sign was in Miles City when I was a kid. I remember that sign. And Peter Warren. In fact, it was still up in the 80s, even though he had been dead for over 15 years. That sign stayed up. That and Get Us Out of the UN. I'll never forget those two signs for as long as I live. But the Brown decision might be the most famous, but there are other really big decisions. We're just going to give you a few to give you an idea of the changes with the Warren Court. Civil rights basically say the 14th Amendment, because that meant that the rights go to the people in the states. States can't deprive people of their constitutional rights. Ingle versus Vital would say no more mandatory school prayer. Now these are almost all in the early to mid-60s, so we just kind of keep that. No mandatory school prayer. And the court case dealt with in Texas, where in one school, almost every school had mandatory prayer, but this one they would do over the loudspeaker, they do the Lord's Prayer, and everybody had to do it or you get detention. And they said no more mandatory prayer. Most of it's Christian, but you can say about any religion. And if you're not a Christian and you have to do the Lord's Prayer, that would be quite an infringement. Now, it doesn't mean you can't pray. You can be praying right now. It just can't be organized. I can't make you pray. You can be praying that this class would end. Praying that you have to take the AP exam. Praying it was summer. But it just can't be mandatory. Don't worry about Baker. Get right to Gideon. Gideon versus Wainwright said, following the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, everybody has a right to counsel. The Gideon decision. And so some states like Montana would do a public defender, very underpaid, overworked. You know anybody who's a public defender? Oh, it's tough duty. Tough duty. They don't pay very well, you know, and especially considering how much law school costs. It's a tough job. Some states like Texas, they just make lawyers like, you must take these cases and do it pro bono for free. It's a real problem in Texas. But next, the Miranda versus Arizona. And that said that people must be made aware of their rights. And within about this is 65, so within about 5 years, that's where you get, they finally came up with a written down thing that everybody must be made aware of their rights. And whenever you watch a bad show with police officers, they always say you have the right to remain silent, etc. That came out of the Miranda ruling. They do not necessarily have to read that, but that was a way to make sure people heard their rights. And lastly, one of the most important cases that people always forget is the Griswold decision. Griswold versus Connecticut said that it is implied in the Constitution, especially the Fourth Amendment, that everybody has a right to privacy. That it never says it in the Constitution, but it's implied, especially the Fourth. And the big issue for the Griswold decision was that Connecticut, along with many other states, banned the sale of birth control. And what they said is that is a privacy decision. That people have this right to privacy to decide on their own whether or not an incredibly important decision like birth control, especially considering the fact of in a society with a wage system, people really desperately want to plan when they have children because of the issue of affording children. Children's expensive. Wait a minute, I have that. Kids are expensive. That was a tip somebody left me. One of the most important decisions, though, because not only would this have future impact down the road, for example, Roe versus Wade about abortion rights, and that was a privacy issue for a person to decide on their own. But also, that's it, we have a right to privacy. And you can see infringements on privacy as years go by, especially after 2001 and the Patriot Act and things like that. But it also says that, yes, we have privacy rights, but you can't find out if law is infringing on it unless you can bring a court case. And so that is the issue that comes here. Montana, in its constitution, all adults have the right to privacy. You don't quite have it yet. Soon. And you have no right to privacy at all, or pretty much in school, technically. That's good and bad, really. There's good elements of that. There really are. But also I can see some issues too. Oh, nothing is ever quite all good and bad. Let's get back to Vietnam. Fun and games in Vietnam. General Westmoreland was command of American forces and South Vietnamese forces. We had a real problem. How do you fight a guerrilla army that avoids confrontation? They will hide in big American groups and then ambush small units. All the Viet Cong have to do is survive. Remember the colonists, the patriots in the Revolutionary War. Survive. And the other thing is this, get this down. As soon as America escalated, sent troops, guess who else sent troops to the South? North Vietnam. As soon as the United States started sending troops, North Vietnam began to infiltrate troops through Laos and Cambodia. We call this the Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after the leader of the North. So how do we win? And the U.S. had a limited number of soldiers. In counterinsurgency, it's assumed that you need a 10-to-1 advantage to defeat a guerrilla army, because you have to defend everywhere. No way the United States is going to have more than 3-to-1. And no way we were ever going to put in 2 million troops. It was not going to happen. How do you win? You got to kill so many that they quit. And a program that Westmoreland would come out with, and it would have limited success at first until the Viet Cong adapted, what's called search and destroy. It is also called flexible response. It was also called spear and net. It was also called counterinsurgency. It was also called sweep and clear. Yeah. And the element is this. What they would do is, there were big operations and small operations. So I'm not going to go through every operation, but to give you the most generic example, they would send American troops out in small units, hoping what would happen to them? Yeah, they'd be ambushed. They're going to be ambush bait, which just is horrible on the morale of the soldiers. And then we blow them away with firepower. And that meant, as soon as the Americans got in with American air power, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese would dig miles of tunnel. We'd have to go into the tunnels and root them out. That's what they call the tunnel rat. Volunteers for that, anybody? Volunteer? I can't even, I'm a little claustrophobic. Just going into the tunnel, these small little tunnels without having somebody shoot at me would scare me, let alone that.
You're already buried.
Huh?
You're already buried.
Thanks, Victor. And we thought with helicopters we could make up the difference. Because we can move troops so fast, we would not have to worry about having such a big advantage. Yes, helicopters did give a huge advantage, but not enough. And then what would we do? The enemy shoots. Now we know where they're at, right? Firepower, artillery, napalm, which is jellied gasoline. That's an F-100 dropping. That's napalm. And that's it burning. And it will burn until it runs out of fuel. Or free fire zones, where we clear out civilians from an area and then bomb every element of it. Remember the reconcentration policy that the Spanish did in Cuba, where they made concentration camps? The US did that too, but we called our concentration camps strategic hamlets. Yes?
I just have a quick question. So there's this movie about this one squadron that gets like stuck in this in this ambush, like survived for a long time. So what's it called? Yeah, that one. Okay.
Yeah, that's about 65, the first air calf. The movie's okay. It doesn't follow the book for a while, but it's got Mel Gibson. And that alone makes it. Does anybody like Mel Gibson? Huh? Anybody with a soul hates Mel Gibson.
Why do you not like it?
There's a lot of reasons. I guess he was a good neighbor. Okay, so B-52s, but I also showed that I don't like Mel Gibson. Don't let me get started on Kevin Costner. All right, these were designed to drop atomic bombs, but they'd be modified to carry 50 to 70,000 pounds of bombs. And they would bomb these areas where they thought the Viet Cong would be organizing. By 68, the US would drop more bombs in the South than all the bombs dropped in all of World War II. Just in the South. That is a string of B-52 array. And here's the problem with this. Yeah, sure. This would be really hard on the Viet Cong if they're there, but what if they weren't? And there's another problem. An iron bomb can't tell the difference between a civilian and a North Vietnamese soldier. Napalm cannot tell the difference between a child and a Viet Cong. And when you bomb and destroy neighborhoods, or sorry, villages, kill civilians, just like what the British did in the South. The British created more patriots, we're going to create more guerrillas. Yeah.
So just kind of.
Yeah. This is the element of bringing total war there because we couldn't figure out any other way to win. But the problem is we're going to make more enemies. And if they can stay in the fight, they will. And we would also drop a horrible herbicide hoping to kill the jungle so they couldn't hide, called Agent Orange. Oh no, this I almost forgot to put this picture in. This is one of the most famous pictures of the war. I know a lot of you have seen it. And there's been a raid on a South Vietnamese village with napalm. That's a napalm attack. And all her clothes have been burned off, and she has third-degree burns over almost her entire body. She's still alive. But a picture of her running in agony. This is South Vietnamese. You know, this is who we're trying to protect, supposedly. And she's horrifically burned. You look at that, you don't realize how badly burned, but there was a TV crew here, and there's a couple shots from the, that's how bad her back was. I can't even imagine the agony of that. That burn. Can't tell the difference. Over 1 million South Vietnamese civilians would die while the United States was involved here. And we'll see the same thing in Iraq, because that's where the guerrillas hide. And no, I'm not saying there's I know a better way. We're not even talking about, not even the judgment here is, do you really want to get involved in these kind of things? This is the herbicide, it's called Agent Orange. And they thought they would kill the jungle. Here's dropping millions of gallons of this stuff. Didn't work, didn't kill enough of the jungle, and it caused women, this would land on civilians and tens of thousands of American and South Vietnamese soldiers. They breathed it in to get into their skin. Women, if women were covered with this, either if they were pregnant or would become pregnant down the road, the children would have horrific birth defects. It was a carcinogenic, so it would cause cancer. So you're going to get thyroid, esophageal cancer, Larynx cancer, which is the worst. I mean, the esophagus, there's nothing they can do. They can't cut out your esophagus. Or thyroid cancer. So you're going to have thousands of American soldiers by the 1980s having cancer because of Agent Orange. And not to mention the thousands, hundreds of thousands in South Vietnam. This desperation to try to figure out a way to win this war. And the only way they would do it is called body counts. They would literally count the number of people we killed. Compared to how many we lost, victory. We lost 5, we killed 50, victory, right? 10-to-1 body count, or kill ratio. What does a dead Viet Cong look like? They literally count. See, we killed so many, they quit. In this kind of war, it's not taking territory, because we can pretty much go any place we want. It's killing the enemy. And as soon as we left, they came right back in. What's a dead Viet Cong look like? What's a dead North Vietnamese soldier look like? Sure, you see a body, that's okay. But what if it's just a pile of dead people or body parts? What if it's an area that's been destroyed by napalm? How many people were killed there? What if it's just a blood spot? What if you see something like marks in ground, like feet were being dragged through, like someone's dragging a body with? How many people died? Let's say you want a promotion. What are you going to say? I didn't see any bodies, or I bet it was 10. Maybe 20. Maybe 30. Soon body counts would be out of the world. By 1968, we killed more Viet Cong than there were Viet Cong. Yeah. Meaning they were lying about the body counts. And it'd be like 50, and it all of a sudden turned to 100 in Saigon when they announced it in the press. And that's when the press started saying, we're like an Alice in Wonderland. Nobody knows what's real. That's why I put a slide from the original Alice in Wonderland. We tried Alice in Wonderland. It's a great story. Wild. And through the looking glass, that's good. Okay. And TV, this is the first war where television was there. And for the most part, except for operations, it was uncensored, but television sanitized it. So they only showed little bits, and the networks were, for the most part, pro-government policy. They were not, for the most part, anti-war. But scenes of war are anti-war. They're so horrible. Even if they're sanitized, they're awful. So you're going to get this movement against the press. The press was against the war, which, no, they weren't. Johnson had gallbladder surgery. He had a 12-inch scar. And he liked to show off his scar, partially because that's the way Johnson was. Look at my bloody scar. But also he had a heart attack 7 years earlier. This is 66. And he wanted to prove it wasn't a heart attack. It was a relatively routine surgery. Now it wouldn't be a 12-inch scar. God, that's awful, isn't it? One of the great cartoons of the war showed the problem with Vietnam. Vietnam, by 66, was becoming a real problem for Johnson's goals. The scar. That is a great cartoon, the map of South Vietnam. Yes, cartoonists had fun with Johnson's nose. And there's Johnson would agonize about this because he knew, but once he jumped in, he couldn't quit. Because if he quit, he'd be the president who lost the war. Anti-war protests began to brew up. One of the most famous, most important groups against war early on was Students for a Democratic Society. And it started as kind of a liberal, pro-civil rights group. But they began to hold teach-ins in colleges to tell college students why the war was wrong. And especially think about college students were the ones, that was the age group being drafted. As the war protests picked up, the biggest anger was about how unfair the draft was. Draft was done arbitrarily by local draft boards, so they just pick people they don't like. That's why Muhammad Ali would be drafted. The draft board of Memphis didn't like him because he talked too much and didn't know his place. Even though he's significantly older, they drafted him. He'd become one of the most famous anti-war protesters, conscientious objector. But if you have a little bit of money, you go to college, and at least for the first 4 years of the war, wouldn't be drafted if you went to college. And so a real divide's happening between families who could afford to send their kids to college and working class families who could not. That means their kids are the ones who are fighting and dying, while these kids got to protest and have fun in college and whine and complain. A real divide is coming. Gee, I wonder if a talented politician would take advantage of that divide. Nixon land is coming. We jump right in. 67, 50,000 protesters marched on Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon. A peaceful march, and let me say one thing about the protesters. Those who were for the war, they were called hawks. They said anti-war protesters, doves. They would put this myth that now has become dominant, that anti-war protesters were a bunch of hippies and drug-addled and causing trouble. That is simply not true. The vast majority came from all walks of life. Almost every anti-war protest was very well organized. Violence usually comes with confrontations with the police, and no one's really clear who started it. And it's arguable that the pro-war people were probably much more violent. Wait to see the hard hat riots. And so that is a good myth, but it was not quite that way, even though these protests, there'd be such a confrontation, especially with working class cops. But McNamara made sure none of these guys had their rifles loaded. It was relatively peaceful. Flowers. Remember that Buddhist monk I showed you who burned himself alive? An anti-war protester did that in 67, right outside of McNamara's window at the Pentagon. Committed suicide right there in front of McNamara, who was changing his mind, much to the chagrin of Johnson. But while that happened, a series of race riots went on too. They called them Long Hot Summers. The most famous, the first really big one would be Watts, which is a bureau of LA, but also Detroit and New York. They called them race riots, but these were mostly African Americans. And the thing was, these riots had triggers. But think of it this way. Years of fighting, and finally we got a Civil Rights Act. We got a Voting Rights Act. Expectations were high. But reality was not meeting the expectations. And this would be an example of the frustration. So that's where I get the expectations high. And there are a lot of reasons for this. First off, it's called de facto segregation. There was segregation all over the North in the big cities. It just wasn't necessarily the law. But there were clearly black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. The very high poverty in these neighborhoods. Also the fact that cities were literally falling apart. Remember I talked about suburbia? And the poor areas were the ones being hammered by budget cuts in the 60s in the cities. And also, almost everyone started with an example of what many people believe, hey, to this day, this happens. So you're going to have disagreements. But many people believed that it was undue police violence. Almost everyone, a young black man would be killed. Happened in Watts, happened in Newark, happened in Detroit, happened in Charlotte, North Carolina. And it's amazing how you see it, what happened in riots in LA in '92. And we have a similar issue we're dealing with today. It was happening in the 30s, it was happening in the 20s. These same things just keep going on, and people think, talk about what's really shaking, you know? Who's getting seasick? So, Lyndon Johnson seemed to kind of sympathize, even though then eventually he also lost patience. He would carry around an index card with all the Great Society laws he passed. And he would hear about these riots, and he would pull it out and say, look what we've done, why are they rioting? He just couldn't understand the desperation. And it's like, we've waited long enough. And these riots have no logic to it. So they're going to do things that will actually make their situation worse. And this is why King and others were so worried that once you give an excuse to crack down, it will ruin the civil rights movement. And we're going to jump right to, oh yeah, that's in LA, that's in Detroit. In Newark, the police chief set up sharpshooters, and they had orders to shoot any black male they saw. Just shoot them, gun them down. They were picking men off, including that 11-year-old boy who was on Life magazine. Over 20 would be killed. That's in the US, that's in a city, and that was the police. That should give you an idea of what was going on. And what you're going to have is this backlash, a conservative backlash. And this is going to be said a lot. It's going to talk about traditional values. States' rights will be code for this. But one of the things they kept saying was, look what happens when you give them rights. You give these people rights and look what they do. And all these government programs was going to them. And they were tired of that. Which is also kind of funny because there's all these government programs going to people that they like. But when it's going to them, they didn't like it. And this would be a common attitude. Once again, talented politicians would take advantage of this resentment. And so here you have the great sign there. That's actually from '71, but it's very appropriate. And this shows support for civil rights movement was high, dropped dramatically in the late 60s amongst whites. You should have seen Martin Luther King's popularity amongst whites. It was about 20%. I always find it fascinating when so many people today will say how much, admire Martin Luther King so much, and he was so unpopular amongst whites then. Kind of sad. But we're going to jump right to this. That's going to be the beginnings of Black Power. And the idea of the Black Power movement was, this nonviolent resistance isn't enough, we're going to have to get it ourselves. Stokely Carmichael would be the leader of the Black Power movement. He came out of SNCC, and God, he was a great speaker. He was, wow. And what he said was, we're going to have to fight for our rights ourselves. But the big thing was, we have to be proud of being black, and that was black consciousness. There's nothing wrong with being black. One of the big problems, as they saw, so many black African Americans were trying to act like whites, and everything good was white. No, it's good to be black. Black name, black clothing, a black culture, that's okay. That's good. I like Stokely Carmichael. He was fired. That was a good picture, but he scared a lot of people in Peoria, Illinois.
So I had work on Sunday and I wasn't able to come to the bank. Like I tried getting it off and nobody would cover me.
Where do you work at?
Target.
Yeah.
Yeah. But isn't it? Did you YouTube it or?
I could.
Okay. So is it just like the first half of stuff we did that I should review or like?
Yeah, I did the first half of that review.
Okay.
We went through almost everything.
So just go through that,
Yeah.
and then the next one's on Wednesday, right?
Yeah, Wednesday at 6:30.
Okay.
And I'm also doing it at lunch.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not here for lunch during Tuesdays and Thursdays, so can I just come in like Wednesdays, Thursdays? Okay.
No problem.
I was gone on Friday. I had a doctor thing for my leg.
Oh, did you not get the practice test?
I guess not. No.
So what we did is we just did a practice test in class. This one on your own. This one, I just gave you this to look at some of the examples for it. So, and this is a really good question about growth of slavery.
Yeah.
And so the good one, just think about the brainstorm, but think about how you would answer it. Just review on your own.
Okay.
And then this is another practice test. So just do on your own when you get a chance. Okay?
All right. Thank you.
I have to read 700 pages for English.
When was it due?
It's due at the end of May.
What book is it?
Gravity's Rainbow.
I don't know. Who wrote that? Sounds familiar, but I can't put it in my mind.
Thomas Pynchon. It's like, it says the most profound and accomplished American novel since the end of World War II.
You know, I know it, but I've not read it. I know nothing about it.
Apparently it's super complex, so
Perfect for you.
I like reading. Yeah. 700 pages.
Wait, what are you reading?
I have problems with it. We just
Get rid of it. Should have never brought.
no,
No, is that what you got? No, really. Stop it. 700. I got. So it's like, why don't they just start with this one here? I don't
Hospitals are cutting jobs all over the country.
but we're not gonna get health security guys. It's like it's smiling.
We have such a messed up system of healthcare.
All the folks that we guys. I read it. JK apparently it's a good one. But it's so much to read that I thought was so freaking chemistry. Yes. Reading words of chemistry. I didn't take science this year. No, it's everything I visit with multiple questions. I wish there was a lab that would make my head. Wait, how many multiple are 60 multiple hours? So you get 8 hour net, which goes by really quickly. And then you have an hour and 45 to answer 3 long answers that plus 4 semi-short answers.